If you thought August couldn't get any wilder, buckle up, because the next several days are about to throw almost everything the atmosphere has at us. Damaging winds, baseball-size hail, a handful of tornadoes, a shot of honest-to-goodness fall air for the Midwest, brutal triple-digit heat holding on in the south, and not one, but two systems spinning up in the Atlantic that could turn into our next tropical storm, and maybe even a hurricane. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's not waste a second and get straight into it. Let's start with the headline. A big storm system is pushing in over the next 2 days, and it's going to do two very different things at the same time. On one hand, it's going to fire off repeated rounds of severe thunderstorms, stretching all the way from the high plains down through the Midwest and into the Gulf Coast. On the other hand, right behind that storm energy, a surge of Canadian air is going to come crashing into the Great Lakes, and it is going to feel like an early preview of autumn. Meanwhile, the South isn't getting any of that relief. The heat and humidity down there are locked in, and on top of it all, we've got two separate tropical disturbances brewing out in the Atlantic that we need to watch closely. So let's break down the severe weather threat day by day, starting with today, Monday. There are 4 separate slight risk zones on the map right now. One is up in the far northern plains, another is out in the high plains, a third is sitting over Louisiana and Mississippi, and the fourth is running right along the Carolina coastline. On top of those 4 zones, there's also a broad marginal risk stretching across most of the Great Plains. The number one concern for today is damaging wind, and we're not talking about a stiff breeze here. Gusts could reach as high as 85 miles per hour in a corridor running from Grand Forks and Fargo all the way back toward Denver, and even stretching into northeastern Nevada. That is an enormous swath of real estate to be watching for destructive straight-line winds. Beyond the wind threat, we're also watching for scattered damaging gusts along both the Gulf Coast and that Carolina coastline. There's a real hail threat too, because a handful of supercells are expected to fire up this afternoon. That risk is centered mainly over Nebraska and southern South Dakota, where some of these storms could be strong enough to produce hail the size of baseballs. Right along the North Dakota-Minnesota border, we should also see at least a couple of supercells develop this afternoon, and those could bring that same large hail threat with them. As for tornadoes today, the primary risk is in North Dakota, where a couple of isolated tornadoes are possible thanks to those discrete supercell storms. There's also a secondary, lower-end tornado risk running along the Carolina coastline near Cape Hatteras, where a couple of supercells could develop and potentially spin up a tornado or two. That area is also dealing with the added danger of heavy rain and possible flash flooding. So you've essentially got a two-headed threat there, flooding rain and tornado potential at the same time. One important note, if you're in that part of North Carolina, any tornadoes that develop today have a good chance of being wrapped in rain, which makes them much harder to see coming. If a tornado warning is issued for your area, get inside immediately. This is not the kind of setup where you want to be outside trying to spot the funnel yourself. Moving into Tuesday, the severe threat doesn't let up. It just shifts and evolves. We'll still have an active zone running from the Central Plains up into the upper Midwest, plus another separate area of concern developing in the southeast. The dominant threat on Tuesday is once again damaging wind. And once again, we're looking at gusts as strong as 85 miles per hour. This time focused mainly on Kansas and Nebraska. There will also be a corridor of isolated damaging gusts running from around Minneapolis up toward Duluth. Forecasters have already flagged the possibility that a slight risk designation could be added to that upper Midwest zone in a future update, which tells you they're taking this seriously. Large hail is expected to be a more isolated concern on Tuesday. Nothing like the baseball-size hail threat from Monday, but still something to watch. And a couple of tornadoes will be possible, mainly in an area running from around Eau Claire, Wisconsin, up toward Duluth, and potentially as far as International Falls near the Canadian border. Then on Wednesday, the severe threat shifts again, this time sliding into the Midwest and Great Lakes region, and we'll get into the specifics of that in a moment. Let's talk timing now, because knowing when these storms will actually be overhead matters just as much as knowing where. For today, most of the severe activity is going to be concentrated up in the northern plains. By this afternoon, expect a cluster of thunderstorms to get going, with maybe 1 or 2 storms remaining discrete rather than merging together right away. Those discrete storms will have enough wind shear working with them that an isolated tornado can't be ruled out, but the bigger overall concerns will be large hail and damaging wind gusts, especially near Grand Forks, Fargo, and western Minnesota this evening, as that cluster of storms tracks south and southeast. Overnight tonight, the severe threat should wind down significantly. Still, if you're in North Dakota, South Dakota, or far western Minnesota, it's worth staying alert late into the evening for damaging winds, large hail, and that small chance of an isolated tornado. Elsewhere, a few more supercells are possible again in Nebraska and South Dakota, similar to what we've seen the past several days, isolated wind and hail with a low but non-zero tornado chance. Tuesday is where things get a little more serious, in my opinion, because the severe weather threat could end up affecting a more densely populated stretch of the Midwest. A low-pressure system will be spinning up over Canada, and that setup should be favorable for supercell thunderstorms to develop. Right now, model guidance suggests the most significant severe weather during the early to mid-afternoon will be over northeastern Minnesota, where enough wind shear will be present for an isolated tornado threat, though damaging wind and large hail remain the primary concerns there. Later in the evening, storms could fire up in western Wisconsin, east of Minneapolis, and if any of those storms manage to organize into supercells, there's a real possibility of an added tornado threat layered on top of the wind and hail danger. Plenty of wind shear will be in place, especially given that this is a surface-based low-pressure system, so that part of the upper Midwest needs to be watched very closely heading into Tuesday afternoon and evening. Further south, if you're in Nebraska or Kansas, Tuesday is shaping up to be a genuinely stormy day, with numerous storms expected to fire. Damaging wind will be the headline threat near areas like Salina and Hayes, and there's a chance that a mesoscale convective system, essentially an organized line of thunderstorms, could form and cause problems through the mid to late afternoon and into the early evening before eventually breaking apart. The tornado threat in that particular zone is expected to stay quite low. By Wednesday, that same Canadian storm system will have tracked eastward, moving over Lake Huron, and that should set the stage for storms to fire up around Lake Michigan during the afternoon. There will be plenty of atmospheric instability building in a corridor stretching from around Kansas City up into northern Michigan, with the best chance for significant severe weather likely centered near Chicago and Peoria. Enough wind shear will be present for another low-end tornado threat, though again, damaging wind and isolated hail will be the more common hazards. A couple of tornadoes are possible, especially later in the day, roughly between 5 and 10 o'clock in the evening, in a zone stretching from around Springfield, Illinois, up toward Grand Rapids and possibly as far as Fort Wayne. Expect this activity to start as a couple of standalone supercells before clustering into a line of storms that eventually weakens heading into early Thursday morning. Here's the bigger picture worth pausing on. This stretch of active weather isn't a one-off. It's genuinely surprising how much severe weather has already piled up this August. This is shaping up to be the most active August in roughly 5 years. And unfortunately, there's no sign of that pattern slowing down anytime soon. After Wednesday, that storm system tracks into the northeast, spreading showers and thunderstorms in a broad zone running from around Atlanta up toward Quebec. Then, on Friday, a brand new storm system is expected to form, once again over the Midwest and Central Plains, bringing another round of isolated severe weather to Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Kansas. Saturday is where the outlook gets more notable. Both Saturday and Sunday could feature the potential for a few significant supercells capable of producing all the classic severe weather hazards: damaging wind, large hail, and tornadoes. I know that sounds like a big claim to make 5 or 6 days out, but multiple models have been consistently hinting at this scenario for a couple of days now, and even the Storm Prediction Center has acknowledged that a slight risk designation might be needed in future outlooks for an area stretching from around Chicago down toward Kansas. Sunday's severe weather looks like it will lean more toward the far northern plains as another storm system develops over southern Canada near Saskatchewan. Then, on Monday, that same system could bring yet another round of severe weather back into the Midwest. Put simply, the final week of August is set up to be extremely active, likely delivering several more rounds of severe weather before we even reach September. Looking that far ahead is always uncertain. But it's worth mentioning that longer-range model guidance is actually hinting at snow in the Rockies by the first week of September. That might not pan out, but it's another signal that this active pattern looks like it's sticking around even as we transition into fall. Now let's talk temperatures, because honestly, that's been one of the biggest storylines of the last several days. Look at what's happening across the Midwest and Great Lakes this morning. Temperatures are diving into the 40s, with some spots in northern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan even dropping into the upper 30s. That is a stunning number for late August. Meanwhile, down near Dallas, the morning low temperature is sitting in the mid-80s. Let that sink in for a second. Some places are waking up colder than other places. Oh, nighttime lows will be. It is absolutely brutal heat down in Texas and Oklahoma, where afternoon highs are easily reaching the triple digits today and tomorrow, and that heat looks locked in for roughly the next 7 days. If you're in the Midwest or Northeast, though, this pleasant, cool stretch isn't going anywhere fast, especially with all these additional storm systems lined up to keep reinforcing it. The next real shot of noticeably cold air looks like it arrives on Friday in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where temperatures could once again dip into the 40s and 50s overnight. At the same time, heat will be building back into the Great Plains, mainly from Kansas down through Dallas by Friday. Then on Saturday and Sunday, that heat is expected to expand northward again, which should help fuel another significant round of severe weather across the Central Plains, potentially reaching into the Midwest and Ohio Valley. Temperatures are going to spike sharply in cities like Kansas City and St. Louis during that stretch. Looking further out, by the first week of September, there are signals pointing toward more notable shots of cold air returning to the Northeast and Midwest, and there's even a chance the Pacific Northwest could see a meaningful cooldown, depending on exactly how these various storm systems evolve over the coming week. There's still a lot of time between now and then for that to change, but the overall signal right now points to September, starting out on the cooler side across much of the country. Now let's shift gears completely and head down to the tropics, because activity out there has genuinely exploded. Mainly in the Pacific, but increasingly in the Atlantic as well, and that's the part we really need to focus on. Right now, there are a couple of tropical storms spinning in the Pacific, but the more pressing story for a lot of us is what's brewing in the Atlantic. There is currently a 50% chance of tropical formation over the next 7 days within the main development region, and separately, there's a growing chance, also around 50% over the next couple of days, of another system forming just east of Bermuda. That Bermuda area system likely won't be a direct threat to the United States. It could send some rip currents toward the New England coastline as we head toward the middle of the week, but if it does fully develop, its most probable track sends it up toward Nova Scotia, potentially bringing some heavy rainfall along the way. The real system to watch, though, is the one forming in the main development region, because this one has the best chance we've seen all season of actually overcoming the wind shear that has been tearing apart nearly every Atlantic system so far this year. There's a real possibility this one could strengthen into a hurricane down the road, so this is a system worth tracking closely over the coming days. Confidence is actually growing that this could become a tropical storm as early as Wednesday. Hurricane model guidance has it intensifying fairly quickly once it organizes, and by Friday, it could already be a fairly powerful system. What happens after Friday is where things get much murkier. Some longer-range guidance keeps this as a strong system that tracks generally out to sea rather than toward the Lesser Antilles, which is good news for those islands. Most ensemble members and model guidance currently keep this system away from land there. That said, nothing has actually formed yet, so there's always room for the forecast to shift. Right now, a building area of high pressure looks like it should be able to steer the system northward before it ever gets close to the Caribbean Sea. Then, as we move into early next week and the first days of September, the system is expected to continue tracking north. A handful of ensemble members bring it a bit closer to Bermuda, but the majority of models and ensemble groupings keep it well out to sea, away from land. So at this point, it doesn't look like this system poses a direct threat to any particular country, but we'll keep a close eye on it in case that changes. It's a good reminder that we're right in the thick of hurricane season and things can shift quickly once a system like this actually gets organized. This tropical wave looks like a strong candidate to become our next named tropical storm, so it's worth checking back for updates as new model runs come in. So to sum it all up, today brings scattered severe storms across the northern plains with a wind and hail threat and an isolated tornado risk, plus a separate flash flood and tornado concern along the Carolina coast. Tuesday shifts the focus toward the upper Midwest and Central Plains with another round of damaging wind, hail, and a few possible tornadoes. Wednesday moves the action into the Great Lakes and Midwest with more of the same. Behind all of that, a sharp blast of early fall air settles into the Great Lakes, while the South continues to bake under triple-digit heat. And out in the Atlantic, we're watching a system that has real potential to become our next hurricane, even as forecasters stress it currently looks likely to stay out to sea. Add in the possibility of a significant severe weather outbreak this coming Saturday and Sunday across the Central Plains and Midwest, and you've got one of the most eventful late August stretches we've seen in years. Let's dig a little deeper into why this particular pattern is producing such a stark split between the North and the South, because it's not just bad luck, it's basic atmospheric physics playing out in real time. When a strong dip in the jet stream, what meteorologists call a trough, digs south into the Great Lakes, it drags cold, dense air down out of Canada behind it. That's exactly what's happening right now. At the same time, out ahead of that trough, warm and moist air gets pulled north, and where that warm, humid air collides with the leading edge of the cooler, drier air, you get instability, the fuel that thunderstorms need to grow tall and become severe. That boundary, sometimes called a dry line or a cold front depending on exactly how it's set up, is essentially the dividing line running through the middle of the country right now, and it's why places just a few hundred miles apart can have wildly different weather on the same afternoon. Grand Forks and Fargo can be dealing with 85-mile-per-hour wind gusts from a supercell, while not too far away, folks are simply enjoying a crisp, sweater weather kind of day. Meanwhile, down in Texas and Oklahoma, none of that cooler air is making it anywhere close. The trough digging into the Great Lakes is actually reinforcing a ridge of high pressure sitting over the south, and that ridge acts like a lid, keeping the heat locked in and blocking any relief from moving in. That's the mechanism behind those brutal morning lows in the mid-80s near Dallas. When overnight temperatures don't drop much, it's a strong signal that the air mass itself is simply saturated with heat, and afternoon highs pushing into the triple digits become almost a given. This kind of setup, with an unusually strong north-south temperature contrast, is also part of what's fueling such a potent severe weather corridor, because the bigger the temperature and moisture gradient across a region, the more energy is available for thunderstorms to tap into. It's also worth explaining what makes a storm capable of producing a tornado versus one that simply produces wind and hail. The storms most likely to spin up a tornado are the ones that stay discrete, isolated rotating supercells rather than a merged line. When a supercell maintains its own updraft and works with strong low-level wind shear, that's the recipe for rotation. And rotation is what's capable of dropping a tornado. Once storms cluster into a line, that individual rotation tends to get disrupted, and the threat typically shifts towards straight-line wind damage and hail instead. That's part of why today's discrete storms in North Dakota carry a slightly higher tornado risk than Tuesday's storms in Kansas, which are more likely to organize into a broader line. Now back to the practical side of things, because forecasts are only useful if you actually know what to do with them. If you live anywhere within today's risk zones, the northern plains, the high plains, Louisiana and Mississippi, or that Carolina coastline, this is the kind of day where you want to have a way to receive warnings, even if you're not glued to a screen. That means making sure your phone's wireless emergency alerts are turned on, or having a no-A weather radio nearby, especially once you get into the overnight hours when a warning could catch people off guard while they're asleep. For those of you along the Carolina coast dealing with that rain-wrapped tornado risk we talked about earlier, this bears repeating: do not wait to see a funnel cloud before you take shelter. Rain-wrapped tornadoes are notoriously difficult to spot, sometimes completely invisible until they're right on top of you, which is exactly why a warning has to be your trigger to act, not a visual confirmation. If you're in the Tuesday or Wednesday target zones of the upper Midwest, the Central Plains, or that stretch running from Chicago to Grand Rapids, take a few minutes today to think through where you'd go if a warning were issued. An interior room on the lowest floor, away from windows, is still the gold standard, whether that's a basement, a bathroom, or a closet near the center of the home. Zooming back out, the real headline here is just how unusually active the atmosphere has been this month, with little sign of that changing. We're looking at organized severe weather essentially every day through the rest of this week, a legitimate, significant severe weather setup taking shape for the weekend, and on top of all of that, a tropical system with real potential to become a hurricane. That's a lot of active weather to track at once, and it's exactly the kind of pattern where checking back daily really matters. So here's the bottom line heading into the rest of the week and the weekend beyond it. Today and tomorrow bring rounds of severe storms marching from the high plains into the Midwest and Gulf Coast, with damaging winds up to 85 miles per hour, hail as big as baseballs, and a few isolated tornadoes, especially in North Dakota and along the Carolina coast. Wednesday shifts that threat into the Great Lakes and Midwest, centered around Chicago and Peoria. Behind it all, a genuine taste of fall settles into the Great Lakes region, while Texas and Oklahoma remain stuck under brutal, prolonged heat with little relief in sight. Saturday and Sunday could bring a more significant severe weather outbreak back to the Central Plains and Midwest, and out in the Atlantic, we're watching a system that has a real shot at becoming our next hurricane, even though current guidance keeps it tracking out to sea rather than toward land. That's the full picture for the days ahead. A lot of moving parts, a lot of contrast from state to state, and a pattern that shows no real sign of settling down before we flip the calendar into September. Stay weather aware, keep an eye on your local forecast office for any updated watches or warnings, and we'll keep tracking every twist and turn of this pattern as it unfolds.